The year was 1944. Europe lay in ruins, scarred by endless battles and the relentless echo of gunfire. In the early hours of a frigid dawn, a line of German women, prisoners of war, stood trembling on frost-laden earth. Their uniforms, once crisp and orderly, now hung loosely on exhausted bodies, streaked with mud, dirt, and the grime of long marches. The cold seeped into their bones, but the chill of fear was far more potent. They had been ordered to line up, not for inspection, not for relocation, but for execution. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of frost beneath boots and the distant rumble of artillery that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Their faces, pale and drawn, reflected a haunting mix of despair and disbelief. Some clutched each other's hands, others stared blankly at the ground, as if trying to imagine a world where the nightmare would end. Soldiers moved along the line with rigid discipline, rifles resting on shoulders, eyes fixed on orders rather than the humanity standing before them. But as the minutes stretched like hours, something extraordinary began to unfold, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, in the faces of those holding the rifles. The steel in their eyes softened. Hesitation replaced rigid adherence. The command to execute hung in the frosty air, but the soldiers were silently questioning it, their hearts caught between duty and conscience. For a fleeting moment, humanity flickered through the fog of war, hinting that mercy could still exist in the unlikeliest of places. The women had been marched out before dawn, their boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, the cold biting through thin layers of clothing that had long since ceased to provide comfort. Each step carried with it the weight of inevitability. Their eyes, wide and haunted, darted across the icy terrain, searching for a hint, any glimmer, that what they were about to face was not absolute. The air itself seemed laden with despair, a frozen mist curling around their faces, clinging to eyelashes and hair, amplifying the sense of desolation that had become their daily companion. Behind them, the rhythmic march of soldiers in rigid formation echoed like a heartbeat, relentless and unyielding. The command had been given earlier, whispered among officers and carried on clipped orders. They were to be executed, not tomorrow, not in some distant, abstract future, but now, here, in the early hours where shadows stretched unnaturally across the frost-covered ground. The women had been told nothing save for the instructions to line up. And yet, even in their confusion, their instincts understood the gravity of the situation. Each had faced fear before, interrogations, cold barracks, endless marches. But this was different. This was the finality of war made tangible, the cold edge of it pressing against skin and soul alike. They lined up mechanically, their postures stiff, hands trembling slightly in the biting cold. Some gripped the arms of their companions, others stared at the ground, willing the frost to swallow them, willing the earth to open and take them inside. Their uniforms, once symbols of discipline and pride, were now ragged, streaked with mud and frost, buttons missing or barely hanging on, sleeves torn from rough labor or careless handling. The letters POW were stitched or painted across their jackets in crude, unmistakable lettering. A label meant to separate, to dehumanize. But in that freezing dawn, they were simply women caught in the machinery of a world gone mad. The soldiers forming the perimeter were trained, experienced, and hardened by years of conflict. Their boots pressed into the frost, rifles held at readiness, eyes scanning the line with a mixture of professional detachment and perhaps a glimmer of hesitation. They were humans trained to follow orders, yet the faces before them, pale, exhausted, fearful, stirred something unexpected. The crisp lines of discipline wavered ever so slightly as they watched these women, young and old alike, trembling under the weight of inevitability. In that moment, the soldiers were confronted not with an enemy in uniform, but with a reflection of their own humanity mirrored in the silent, desperate eyes of those they were ordered to kill. A cold wind blew across the plain, cutting through coats and jackets, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth, gunpowder, and frost. It swept through the line of women like a physical force of awareness, brushing their cheeks, stiffening their limbs, yet somehow awakening something within the soldiers as well. Each movement seemed amplified, a shiver, A tightening of hands, a blink too long, a breath held in anticipation. Time stretched. Seconds became minutes. Each tick of the clock felt like hours to the women, whose minds raced between the memories of home, family, and all that they had lost. They wondered if anyone outside this desolate field even remembered them. The thought was fleeting, but it hung in the cold air like smoke from a distant fire. The tension between duty and conscience began to manifest. The officers, standing a step apart, exchanged glances that were brief but heavy with meaning. Orders had been clear, executed with precision countless times in the past. But today, something was different. As they watched the women's faces, hollowed by exhaustion, streaked with frost, pale as the first light creeping over the horizon, they were forced to consider a question that war rarely allowed: what is right when everything is wrong? The line wavered, both physically and metaphorically, as hesitation crept into even the most disciplined ranks. The rifles that had been leveled, the hands that had been steady on triggers, now trembled with the weight of possibility, with the dawning realization that an act of mercy was within reach, if only they dared to take it. The women, unaware of the subtle shifts occurring among the soldiers, continued to stand in a frozen line, their breaths fogging in the icy air. Some closed their eyes, silently praying. Others pressed their fists into the mud at their feet, gripping what little control remained over their trembling bodies. There was a sense of unity among them, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the fragility of life and the brutality of the moment. And yet, amid the fear, a faint hope began to stir, a whisper of possibility that perhaps, against all odds, they would not meet the fate promised to them just hours before. A bird, the first sign of life in an otherwise desolate landscape, cried out somewhere in the distance. Its sharp note cut through the heavy stillness like a single thread in a tapestry of silence. The soldiers, hearing it, seemed to pause, perhaps reminded subconsciously of the world beyond the frost-covered field, of life continuing despite the shadow of war. For a fleeting second, the mechanics of execution faltered. A glance here, a hesitation there, a rifle slightly lowered. Tiny movements that carried enormous significance. These small acts became monumental, tiny cracks in the wall of inevitability, through which humanity shone like a fragile, trembling flame. Then it happened. A soldier, the youngest among them, shifted his weight, eyes locking briefly with the nearest woman in line. He saw not an enemy, but a reflection of vulnerability, of fear, of life itself pleading silently for acknowledgement. The rifle in his hands felt impossibly heavy, the metal biting into his palms as if aware of the moral weight it now bore. He swallowed, breath visible in the cold air, and took a deliberate step back. Another followed, and another. The line of soldiers wavered, their formation subtly broken, a ripple of hesitation passing down the ranks. The command to execute still lingered, unspoken yet palpable, but the human heart had intervened, and in that instant it was enough to change everything. The women noticed the change before understanding it. Eyes widening, they exchanged glances, uncertainty and cautious hope mingling in equal measure. The frost-laden ground beneath them seemed to hold its breath, the dawn light spilling over the horizon in muted oranges and pale blues. For the first time since that morning began, the machinery of war faltered, revealing the delicate threads of compassion that could survive even here, in the midst of cruelty. It was a suspended moment in history, a heartbeat of mercy that refused to be ignored, a reminder that even amid devastation, humanity could assert itself. And as the soldiers paused, rifles lowered, the women slowly lifted their heads, scanning faces that moments before had symbolized death. Now, they were faced with uncertainty, but it was uncertainty born of mercy, of hesitation transformed into grace. The cold wind continued to whip across the field, but it carried with it a faint warmth now. The warmth of possibility, of lives spared, of the fragile triumph of conscience over command. The moment was fleeting yet eternal, etched into the frozen landscape of that early morning and into the hearts of all who witnessed it. A testament to the enduring power of empathy, Even in the darkest chapters of human history, mercy arrived quietly, without fanfare, without the clanging of orders or the harsh bark of command. It arrived in small gestures, almost imperceptible, yet monumental in their significance. The soldiers, still standing around the line of trembling women, shifted uneasily on the frost-covered ground. Their rifles, once raised with precision and cold intent, now hung loosely in their hands. Fingers brushed against the trigger guards, hesitant, as if the metal itself had gained weight from the moral burden it now carried. One soldier stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, breaking the rhythm of death that had been rehearsed in their minds since early morning. In his hands, he carried a tattered blanket, folded unevenly, edges fraying from long use. He held it out to the nearest prisoner, a young woman whose pale face was streaked with mud and tears. Her eyes widened, disbelief etched into every line of her exhausted expression. She hesitated for a heartbeat, caught between instinctive fear and the surreal reality of kindness. The soldier's voice, quiet and careful, barely rose above the whisper of wind across the frozen field. "Take it, keep warm." The words were simple, but in that simplicity, they carried more weight than any command he had ever given in training, more meaning than any war order. The woman reached for the blanket with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting, almost accidental touch, a human connection in the midst of dehumanization. Other soldiers followed, each moved by the same unspoken realization that mercy, small though it might be, could exist even in the heart of war. One knelt to offer a cup of water to a woman whose lips were chapped, cracked from the cold and stress. She drank with careful sips, her body shivering as she tried to absorb warmth and relief from the simple gesture. Another soldier adjusted a worn coat over the shoulders of a woman whose uniform hung loose, tattered, incapable of shielding her from the bitter dawn. Each action, seemingly trivial, was monumental in its defiance of the violence that had been so meticulously planned. The women blinked through tears, their minds struggling to reconcile fear with the impossible kindness now unfolding before them. As these acts of mercy spread, the frozen ground itself seemed to soften in metaphorical response. The frost glittered faintly in the early sun, a sparkling counterpoint to the harshness of the moment. Breaths hung in the air, visible as misty clouds, rising and mingling with the frost-laden wind, creating a surreal haze where life and death seemed suspended in the balance. The women's collective body language shifted, shoulders unclenched, heads lifted slightly, eyes scanning faces no longer marked by immediate intent to harm. Hope, fragile but insistent, began to thread its way through their hearts, a golden strand woven into the gray of despair. The moment was more than just physical acts, it was a moral awakening. The soldiers' hesitation had become action, and action had become courage. They were defying orders, yes, but they were affirming something far greater, that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. The women, sensing the profound significance of the gestures, whispered to each other, voices soft and hesitant, sharing disbelief and gratitude in broken syllables. They let us live. One murmured, as if speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile illusion. Another nodded, lips trembling, eyes scanning the faces of those who had moments ago been instruments of possible death. Silence, punctuated only by the soft crunch of frost under boots or the faint gusts of wind, became a canvas on which empathy painted its subtle strokes. The early sunlight began to warm the cold horizon, filtering through mist and frost, highlighting the small acts with a kind of divine focus. The women's faces, previously pale and drawn, now caught rays of light that seemed to reflect an inner glow. The recognition that life had been spared, that cruelty had been interrupted by conscience. For a moment, the world felt larger, more humane, as though the frozen expanse around them could contain both fear and mercy simultaneously. In the shifting balance of the battlefield, the soldiers themselves seemed to transform. Their faces softened, shoulders lowered, postures straightened, but no longer rigid in preparation for violence. They observed the women with a mix of relief, apprehension, and quiet pride. For the first time that morning, they experienced the full weight of choice. the monumental act of selecting compassion over destruction. They understood instinctively that the consequences of mercy could ripple far beyond the frozen field, into the hearts of the women, into the consciousness of their comrades, and into the memory of the world itself. Some soldiers lingered in subtle gestures of care, offering support for those too weak or frightened to stand fully on their own. One extended a hand to a woman whose knees wobbled beneath her, guiding her gently without force. Another quietly adjusted the position of a hood to protect a head from frostbite, small motions laden with profound intent. There was no fanfare, no applause, only the soft, human rhythm of shared vulnerability and grace. And in response, the women's posture, long stiff with terror, began to relax ever so slightly. Tiny smiles, shy, tentative, flitted across faces as though their hearts, long frozen by fear, could now dare to beat again in the presence of mercy. The act of compassion reverberated through the group like ripples across a pond. Even those soldiers who had initially hesitated to act now found themselves swept along, caught in the quiet momentum of humanity asserting itself. A shared understanding passed between them. This was not weakness, not dereliction, but a moral victory in a landscape dominated by brutality. In small gestures, offering warmth, water, or simply a moment of acknowledgement, they communicated that even in war, the human heart could defy the dictates of orders and policy. The women, sensing the moral courage radiating from their captors, began to hope in ways that had seemed impossible mere minutes before. Time stretched, elastic and dreamlike, as the frost-covered field became a tableau of defiance, mercy, and fragile life. The early light grew stronger, reflecting off ice crystals and illuminating pale, trembling faces with a soft, almost ethereal glow. The women's eyes, previously fixed on the ground, now scanned the scene in disbelief, taking in every small act of kindness. They noted the hands extended, the blankets draped over shivering shoulders, the shared glances between soldiers signaling unspoken agreement they would not end these lives today. And in this tableau, a powerful truth crystallized. The capacity for mercy, even in the heart of war, could create moments of beauty and hope that rivaled any act of violence in significance. As the sun climbed slowly over the horizon, its warmth touched the frost-covered field, illuminating the delicate balance between fear and hope, despair and compassion. The women, wrapped in blankets, drinking water, and supported by steady hands, began to whisper softly among themselves, voices blending with the wind. They spoke of disbelief, gratitude, and quiet prayers, marveling at the kindness that had interrupted what they had assumed would be the end. Each gesture, each moment of attention, was monumental, a reminder that humanity could assert itself even in the harshest of conditions. The soldiers, too, felt the resonance of the moment. Their rifles were no longer weapons of imminent death, but silent witnesses to the choices they had made. They had defied orders, yes, but they had affirmed life, and in doing so, they had created a space where fear could coexist with hope, where despair could meet grace. The frozen ground, the early mist, the cold light of dawn, all of it became part of a living memory, a record of a moment when ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, chose humanity over cruelty, and so the frozen field, once a stage for execution, became a testament to the quiet power of mercy. The women, still trembling, began to lift their heads higher, eyes catching the first golden rays of the morning sun. The soldiers watched, silently proud, silently relieved, knowing that in the midst of chaos and death, they had preserved something precious, the fragile, enduring spark of human compassion. It was a moment that would echo far beyond the frost-laden expanse, etched into memory, history, and conscience alike, a story of courage, restraint, and the simple, transformative power of mercy. The aftermath of mercy was almost surreal. The field, once prepared for execution, remained cold and frost-covered, yet the atmosphere had shifted. What had been a place of imminent death now bore the quiet weight of life preserved. The women huddled together instinctively, forming small clusters against the biting wind, their bodies seeking warmth in the touch of one another. The tremors in their limbs had not yet fully subsided, but there was a subtle change in posture. cautious relief that spoke louder than words. Whispers passed between them, hesitant, shaky, filled with disbelief and tentative gratitude. Did we survive? One voice asked softly, and the answer hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. They had survived not because of chance, but because soldiers had chosen humanity over orders. The soldiers, meanwhile, began to step back, leaving space between themselves and the group of prisoners. Their expressions were a mixture of tension, relief, and quiet introspection. Some glanced at the horizon, as if drawing strength from the pale morning light spilling across the frosty ground. Others looked at their hands, rifles lowered, tracing the lines of their palms as though trying to reconcile the enormity of what they had just done. They had defied command, a decision that could have carried consequences far beyond this field. But the act of sparing lives had forged a moral victory that far outweighed fear of reprisal. The frozen earth bore witness to the courage of conscience, and for a fleeting moment, the machinery of war paused, leaving only human hearts beating, uneasy yet proud. The women, still huddled together, whispered softly, exchanging glances filled with disbelief. Each had a story, a life, memories of home and family, hopes for a future now uncertain yet suddenly imaginable. One young woman pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart, as though confirming the miracle of continued life. Another adjusted her coat, now layered with the blankets handed out earlier, eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers who had spared them. She tried to smile, a fragile, hesitant curve that carried the weight of gratitude and astonishment. Each small motion was a testament to resilience, a quiet celebration of survival in a world that had shown them little mercy until this moment. As the morning light intensified, it revealed more of the frozen landscape, stark and unforgiving, yet softened by the human drama that had unfolded upon it. Frost glistened on blades of grass and icy patches on the ground, catching the light like scattered diamonds. The soldiers' shadows stretched long across the terrain, intersecting with those of the huddled women in an unintentional tapestry of hope and humanity. Silence enveloped the field, punctuated only by the distant hum of war, the reminder that outside this frozen pocket, conflict still raged. Yet here, in this improbable moment, a new narrative had been written, one not of death, but of mercy, defiance, and the enduring power of conscience. Some soldiers lingered, walking slowly among the clusters of women, offering small gestures of continued care. One crouched to tie a shoelace that had come undone, while another offered water to a trembling prisoner. Each act, though modest, carried immense significance, a reaffirmation of the choice that had been made. The women's eyes met those of their benefactors with silent understanding, acknowledging that these men had chosen life over execution, compassion over obedience. The warmth of these exchanges, subtle though it was, contrasted sharply with the bitter chill of the morning air, and yet it was enough to create an almost sacred atmosphere, one where humanity triumphed, if only temporarily, over the cruelty of war. Even the environment seemed to respond to this extraordinary reversal of fate. The frost on the ground, though still present, seemed less oppressive. The wind, while still sharp, carried whispers of sunlight and hope, rustling through the soldiers' coats and the prisoners' blankets alike. The women adjusted their positions, leaning slightly into the warmth of the small circles they had formed, finding strength in proximity to one another. Their collective body language shifted from fear and resignation to cautious alertness, a readiness to absorb life once more, however fragile. It was a subtle transformation, imperceptible to an outside observer, but monumental to those living it, the reclaiming of agency, the rediscovery of breath, heartbeat, and the possibility of tomorrow. The psychological impact of mercy extended beyond the immediate moment. The soldiers, having exercised conscience in defiance of orders, carried a mix of relief and reflection. Their expressions, marked by both tension and a subtle pride, suggested that they understood the moral weight of what they had done. They had chosen to protect life when destruction was expected, to exercise judgment when obedience demanded violence. Even in a theater of war where actions were dictated by necessity, rules, and fear, they had proven that humanity could survive. This choice, seemingly small in the grand mechanics of battle, would linger in memory long after the frost had melted, long after the field was abandoned, echoing in the hearts of those spared and those who spared them. The women began to shift from huddled clusters to slow, tentative movement. Some adjusted their blankets, pulling them tightly around shoulders stiff with cold. Others brushed frost from coats and hair, careful to reclaim some semblance of dignity in the aftermath of terror. Their whispers, once tinged with disbelief, grew slightly stronger, interwoven with fragments of hope, thoughts of surviving family, of returning home, of rebuilding lives interrupted by the machinery of war. Every small action became an assertion of life over death, a deliberate reclamation of agency stolen in the hours before. The soldiers, observing quietly, recognized these gestures, understanding that the simple act of sparing them had created more than temporary relief. It had allowed a measure of continuity, a thread connecting past, present, and an uncertain but now possible future. The early sun climbed higher, casting its light across the field in pale gold tones. The frost sparkled in the illumination, contrasting with the gray uniforms of the soldiers and the muted coats of the women. Long shadows stretched across the terrain, interweaving with one another like silent witnesses to the choices that had been made. It was a tableau that spoke of resilience and morality, of lives spared in the midst of death's preparation. The women's faces, previously pale and hollowed with fear, now caught the light in ways that revealed astonishment, tentative hope, and the quiet awakening of relief. Each expression told us stories of survival, of empathy received against all odds, and of the subtle, enduring power of human conscience in the darkest moments. As minutes passed, the women began to speak more audibly among themselves, whispering gratitude, relief, and disbelief in equal measure. Some laughed quietly, a fragile sound that trembled in the cold air, as though the very act of survival was both miraculous and surreal. Others touched one another's hands or shoulders, seeking reassurance in the shared reality of life preserved. The soldiers, standing at respectful distances, observed these interactions silently, a collective recognition passing among them that their choice had shifted the course of these lives in ways that would resonate far beyond the frozen morning. Each had made a conscious decision, and each would carry the memory of it forward, as proof that inhumanity could be resisted, even under orders and expectation. Eventually, the frost began to glisten more brightly under the growing sun, revealing small details previously hidden in the shadow of fear. The soldiers' breath rose in white clouds, merging with the mist that hovered near the ground, creating a surreal backdrop for a moment of unexpected grace. The women's eyes adjusted to the light, taking in the expanse of the field, the softened expressions of the men who had spared them, and the beauty of survival itself. It was a moment suspended between past and future, where fear still lingered but hope began to take root. The frozen execution ground had been transformed into a scene of life reclaimed, a quiet testament to the enduring possibility of compassion. Finally, as the women slowly rose from their huddled positions, blankets draped around shoulders and water sipped from the cups offered, the soldiers took a few steps back, allowing space for movement and observation. The field was now quiet, save for the occasional whisper or soft shiver of frost. The early sun continued to climb, warming the scene in pale light, illuminating faces marked by survival, relief, and awe. Both soldiers and prisoners understood that this moment was fleeting, yet monumental. A fragile intersection where humanity had won over orders, where mercy had triumphed over execution. The frozen landscape would remain, but it was forever changed by the choices made here, a silent witness to courage, restraint, and the quiet heroism of conscience.